Hey, so really glad that you're here this morning. I want to start our time together just by reading a couple lines and a real small paragraph that are really cool inside of this book. Okay, just take a listen to this. This is what it says. Freedom stood silently, looking concerned. Cam appeared more frustrated by the second. He was clearly not taking the news of Elizabeth running against him well, when all of a sudden an idea popped into my head. We had a secret agent right next to us who could find out all of the intel. I looked Liberty in the eye so he would focus. Liberty, it's time for you to go into stealth mode, I said. Your mission is to visit their gathering and discover as much as you can about what they're planning. Isn't that the best? You're not sure because you don't know what I'm reading. But you just trust me, that's good. That is good, right? Now, there's part of the reason I love it is because I not so secretly want to be Jason Bourne, and the word stealth is in here, okay? So like stealth mode, I'm all in, let's do this thing, let me be that, right? I mean, that's incredible, okay? But I mean, that's good. Here, I want another one. I want to read you a few lines from a poem that I think it's a really cool little poem. Here are just a few lines from it. A smelly goat arrived in Spain. You can tell already this is a rich poem, yes? Now he's in India, you see. My grandpa always thinks of me. Don't you feel it? What are you doing? I mean, don't you feel that? Come on, listen, here's the deal. I mean, that's gold. Your life should be better because of that. Now, here's the thing. Here's why it's a little bit of a challenge. You don't actually know what I'm reading from. Full disclosure, I've never even read the first book I read from. I've never read it. I scanned it looking for a paragraph that sounded fun, and I came across that word stealth, and I started playing Jason Bourne movies in my head. I'm like, that's the one, okay? I've never read it. I have an idea what it's about. If I told you the title, you would have a really good idea what it's about as well. The second book is a book of all poems, which a lot of you have probably read. If I told you the title, it's classic. You've probably read it. Our girls have read it multiple times. But you don't know what I'm reading. And in fact, the first one, I didn't even know what I was reading. And so it's a little tough to get kind of excited about that. It's a little tough to. Context means everything, yes? I mean, context means a lot. And yet, if we're really honest with one another and we just took a survey of the land in which we live and the day in which we live, we kind of hear life in bits and parts like that, right? Listen, you do know, right? No matter how many news articles or stories you've heard, read, or watched in the last decade, none of them has been complete. Or you hear a bit and a part, right? It's just a little. When you read an article in a magazine, it's a part because a whole story can't be chronicled inside of one magazine, right? I read to you bits and parts and didn't even tell you what bits and parts I was reading. And so it's impossible to kind of understand like what's really happening there. What I can do is I can feel your frustration about those two books by talking about them aimlessly for the next 30 minutes or so, by maybe making it feel like school and giving you a little pop quiz and then shaming you and guilting you when you don't know the answers. Right? Now, I won't because we live in America and you passed another church to get here and you would just go to a different one on the way. Oh, I understand that, right? But we could, okay? And yet if we're really just kind of candid with one another for a moment, here's the tension. With really good motives, hear me on this, with really good motives, with really true desires, that's a lot of times how we approach the Scriptures. We engage the Scriptures in bits and parts, and we're trying to get some handle, and we're trying to get some understanding, and we read a part, and we think, well, I kind of get that. I think, and we go to another part, and I'm like, now I'm confused, and I don't get it, and it's kind of a big book, so where do I start? And man, I've tried to start in the beginning, and then I tried to start in the end, and so now I've tried the middle, and like, how do I make sense of it when really all that's happening when I read these bits and parts is what it feels like is I'm just adding To the sense of inadequacy I might have already brought to the table, I'm just adding to the layers of intimidation and frustration I might have already brought to the table. I'm kind of making it worse. That's why over the next handful of weeks inside of this series called The Story of God, we're simply trying to say, look, how is it we could see the whole story of God as one story and how those bits and parts and pieces work together so that at the end of the day, when we read the stories within the story that would somehow have a place, it would have a part, it would be part of the rhythm of this grander story. So we could maybe read a paragraph from the middle, some lines from a section, and have an idea of, but here's where we are in the bigger story. Here's how this can make sense. So over the next few weeks, we're just going to take that journey and that experience together and say, how do we get a handle on this story of God? And we're going to look at just some of the major moves in this story. Now, I could have helped both of those initial readings. I could have helped if I would have given some context, if I would have told a little bit about the story or a little bit about the poem. And then it would have been even nicer if I actually would have started at the beginning. Okay? So today, that's what we're going to do with the story of God, is we're just going to go back and we're going to start at the beginning to kind of get some context around what's happening. So if you've got a Bible and you want to turn there, we're going to be in the book of Genesis for a little bit. It's super easy to find. It's page 1. Or if you're going on a phone or something like that, it's going to be the first book listed inside of the letters and the literature composed inside of the Bible. And so you can just begin to look that up. In Genesis 1, and really we're going to bounce around a little bit, 1, 2, and 3 this morning, what we'll find is really kind of where it all begins. Like, we're going to find some context that will help the rest of the story start to make a little bit of sense. So Genesis 1, I'm just going to read the first 4 words of this account, and regardless of what translation you have something like these first 4 words. In the beginning, God. Those 4, in the beginning, God. In the very beginning, God. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. Like in the beginning, God, and then it kind of takes off running, and you probably have some ideas of where it's starting to run already, but here's what we learned 4 words into the story. 4 words in. Is that it's actually not your story. And it's not my story. It's not even our story. 4 words in, we get both the sobering and comforting revelation that it's actually God's story. It's a story that God wrote. It's a story that's about God. It's a story that we're invited to be a part of, but it's a story that invites us to see God's story and our place in it, rather than looking all of the time for our story and what God's place might be in it. It's God's story. God launches that. And then that kind of allows us to set aside some of the frustration we have when we approach the Bible so often looking for our answer or our thing or our story, when the first invitation is to first see God in His own story. And then you might know that what comes next is this unbelievable expression of God creating things. God creating water and land and earth and skies and night and day and sun and moon, right? I mean, just launching this unbelievable expression of creation, and it's remarkable and it's beautiful and it's layered and it's got texture and color and pizzazz, and He's speaking it all into existence. It's this incredible display of God's power, and there's so much in it. Right, there's some science in it. There are some patterns that are launched in it. There's a ton of motion. Here's the risk, or maybe the temptation, is that it gets really easy to read the creation account in the first part of God's story and to only see all the motion. And to start to think about that science and to start to think about how it went and to start to think about the literal development, all of which has its place. All of which has its place. But look, here's what we know just about life in general. It's true about God, it's true about us. Is that every motion is launched by a motive. Every motion is launched by a motive. Every motion we make, everything we engage in, every decision we make, every project we launch, that is launched by a motive. There's actually a motive to God's creation. There's actually a motive to God unleashing all of this creative power. There's a motion to that. So what is, other than just to display this big and this power and this strength? Well, if we look down towards the end of chapter 1, right around verse 26 or so, we kind of get into these few verses, 26, 27, 28, but around verse 26, this is what we find as God begins to create humans, people like you and me. It says this, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. Now, do you see a small challenge happening here? There's a bunch of plural language, and yet the only person in the story is God. We're getting this first window into this idea that God is one, but has three persons. It's this theological term called the Trinity, where there is God the Father who is leading and shaping and guiding. There is God who is Jesus the Son. In fact, later in the story of God, we read that Jesus was very present and active in this creation. And then we read a few verses before this that there is this Holy Spirit of God that's literally hovering over this creation with this breath and this life and this creative energy and power. There is God in three persons. He's one and He's in three persons. And yet it's one thing to try and pick that apart, but here's what we got to understand. We're getting a window into how God relates. You see, there is this Father and this Son and this Holy Spirit. And if we follow this God throughout the story of God, what we begin to find is that the persons of God, Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, they're very deferring. They're always pointing to the other one. It's always the Father pointing to the Son, and the Son pointing back to the Father and to the Spirit, and the Spirit pointing to the Son. It's very, what one writer calls it divine shyness. There's all this power and all this might, and they're all always kind of deferring and humbly pointing toward the other. It's actually a really cool mark of healthy relationships, right? The healthiest relationships are when people are pointing to one another instead of arguing about how I can point to myself. God's giving us a window into this thing. There's this full relationship and health and strength. There's this full loving relationship. And so here's the sobering reality. It's out of that relationship that God creates humans, you and me. But God's living in this perfect, humble, deferring, loving relationship, which means that God didn't create out of need. God didn't create because He lacked something. God didn't create because He was struggling with scarcity. Now, listen, we all want to be needed. Right? We all want to be needed. But God didn't create you and He didn't create me because He needs us. Sobering, but dear heavens, also a little freeing. If God didn't create out of need, if God didn't create out of scarcity and lack, then what? We see God's got this perfect relationship. It's a relationship that's full of love, full of shared love and reciprocated love and back and forth. And it's that love that actually motivates God to create. God actually created out of the overflow of his love. God actually created people like you and me, not out of need, not out of desperation, but because he had so much love that it had to get out. It had to be expressed. He had so much love that the natural result was this creative power that created people like you and me. God created out of the overflow of his love. Now listen to me. Listen, I fully understand that a lot of us, we live with a view of God in which we think we kind of live like God maybe has a dropper of love and he is measuring the drops very carefully. Listen, when it comes to love and love shared, God doesn't even know what a dropper is. God created out of this overflow, this abundance, this plenty of love. He created to express that love and as an expression of that love. Which means this, that your life, your very life, was created by a singular motive, love. Your life was created by a singular motive, to love. Which means that this day was created for you in love. This morning, created for you in love. The nap I hope you get this afternoon, created for you in love. Can I get an amen? Hey, there it is. Okay. Yeah. Don't take it yet. Okay. Created in love. Every fiber of your being was created, motivated by this overflowing love. Listen. I know. Our stories are many and they're diverse and they're layered. And for some of us, it's hard to comprehend that God would create us out of love because our only current image of God is one that's distant at best and harsh and angry at worst. Maybe he just kind of spun it into motion and then left it not to be annoyed and bothered again. Maybe he's angry and disappointed and quite honestly just fed up. And so the idea of that he would have created us out of love, it's hard to reconcile. But everything else in the story is influenced by this beginning point. And if God's motive was to create us out of the overflow of his love, to get that love expressed to people like you and me, what was he trying to give us? Well, see, love is enjoyed. Love in its truest, most pure form, it's enjoyed. It's desired. Much like we think we all want to be needed, we all know we want to be loved. So in that expression of love, what did God give us to enjoy? There's probably countless things. I just want to have us consider a few of them this morning. The first one is simply this, that God created us out of the overflow of his love so that we could enjoy his presence. So that we could just enjoy his presence. It's him. It's God. It's this one overflowing in love. And I was like, don't you know, it's hard to not enjoy being around people who are so stinking loving. Right? And here's God in this perfected form of love saying, look, I want to create you out of my love so that you can enjoy my presence. And he was with them. He was with these humans in the garden. And in fact, a couple of chapters later, in a window of where things are starting to break a little bit, there's actually this picture of one of the ways in which God related to them. Genesis 3:8 says that God would walk in this garden, in this place called Eden in which he had created them. He would walk with them in the cool of the day. In the cool of the day. He was walking. He was that close. Walking by their house, through their neighborhood, through where they went to work, through where they spent their leisure time. God was walking in this garden where he had created them. Listen, Eden was God's dream. The story of God is about God's dream first. It's not about our dream first. It's about his dream first. And Eden was his dream. And if you want a little bit of a head start through all these moves in the story of God, I'll tell you this much, that God always finishes what he starts. And what God starts, God's going to finish. God's dream was this Eden experience, these humans, these men and these women in this loving relationship where they experience the fullness of his presence. And a little bit later in the story of God, we read one writer who, writing about his relationship with God, he says, man, God, what I'm coming to grips with is that in your presence, that's where the fullness of joy actually is. In your presence, when I'm experiencing the fullness of your love, that's where the natural result is fullness of joy. A joy that it can't be contained or capped off in any way. God created you out of the abundance and overflow of his love so that you could enjoy his presence. He didn't create you out of the overflow of his love so that he could ignore you. It's so that he could be with you. He also created us to enjoy partnership. And to enjoy partnership with him, really. Say, look, I've created you out of the overflow of my love, and while you enjoy my presence, what I also want you to enjoy is partnership with me, is being with me. By the time you get to Genesis chapter 2:15, there's this little picture of God saying, hey, this is what I want you to work on. This is what I've given you. The Lord God took the man, he put him in this Garden of Eden to work it. Now look, I understand that some of us think about bliss and work is nowhere on the radar. Yes? We know, study after study after study shows that most of us don't find fulfillment in our jobs. It's not what, right? And yet here, in this perfected place still, God says, I want you to work. The Hebrew picture for work there is action done to serve the one who invited us. It's to work in a way that serves the one that invited us into the work. And so Adam, he's not working to prove his identity. He's not working to establish his identity. He's working out of this identity as one created out of the overflow of God's love. He's working in the garden. He's working the land. He's working the soil out of this place of already being loved, overflowing in love by the God who created him. God says, look, I want you to partner with me. I want you to know the thrill of being about what I'm about and serving me in what I'm about. And much like God will always finish what he starts when it comes to his presence, over and over and over again in the story of God, there's this invitation to continue to be people who are loved by God and out of that love are inspired to partner with God. Because God always finishes what he starts. Now, presence, that kind of sounds good, right? Like, let's have God's presence. That sounds good. I like that. Partnership doesn't even sound terrible because, if we're going to team up with anybody, it might as well be God. Right? I mean, we can find some traction there. The next one might be a little more challenging to comprehend, especially in the season of life we seem to be living in our world today. But it's just as true, and that is that God also created us out of the overflow of his love to enjoy people. People. I know, challenging sometimes, yes? Don't look now at the person you're sitting next to, but it's challenging sometimes, yes? Okay. People. You see, God actually created us to enjoy the other humans, the other men and women that he was creating. He said, hey, look, I'm going to give you this gift of people, and I'm going to write the story as full of other people in it. And I want you to enjoy them. Look, we'll go back to verses 26 and 27 in chapter 1, and this is what it said. Then God said, here it is. Let us make humanity in our own image, in our likeness. So God created humanity in his own image. What was his image? this humble, loving, deferring relationship. God created us to live inside of relationship like He was already living inside of relationship. God created us to live in humble, deferring, loving relationships. And yet it doesn't take much for us to come to grips with reality that that's not how most of us are experiencing life, yes? Pastor Mark and I last Christmas time talked about the reality that there just is a medically described and diagnosed loneliness epidemic in the world in which we live. A frightening percentage of us live around lots of people, but very alone. Which means I know that when we put this many people in a room on a Sunday morning, a really large number of us are struggling with just feeling alone, separated, isolated, alone. And here's the good news. It's that you're not actually alone. You're not actually alone. There are other people who identify with your story. There are other people who wrestle with or have wrestled with loneliness. There's a God who created you, that actually created you to enjoy His presence and enjoy other people. And what God started, God's going to finish. God's going to give us healthy ways to live in healthy relationships. It's part of what we'll see develop in His story that begins with Him and starts with the overflow of His love. Now see, here's why this matters so much. Over the next few weeks, we could just inundate one another with this page after page after page of notes. Look, I promise you this. If we wanted to, if we wanted to share in this together, we could load each other up with knowledge about the Bible. Tons of it. Okay? All of which would be good. But if we miss the initial motive, all we're really doing is kind of expanding our mind and puffing up our own confidence in what we can know. See, we got to come to this understanding that at the beginning of the day, every move in the story of God, every single move in the story of God is shaped and influenced by His heart and creation. Every single move in the story of God, everyone is shaped by His heart and creation. When we read about God doing the miraculous, it's shaped by His creation. When we read about God encountering people who are rebelling and pushing away, and we see God carrying at the same time sadness and anger, it's shaped by His motive in creation. When we see God healing, it's shaped by His motive in creation. When we see Jesus giving His life, it's shaped by His motive in creation. When we see God painting a picture of the future, it's shaped by His motive in creation. Every single time. When we see God apparently being silent, it's shaped by His motive in creation. When we see God inspiring and launching dreams and supernaturally empowering people, it's shaped by His motive in creation. Every move of the Bible is shaped by that. And so when we begin to read in different parts of this story of God, and we read them with this launching pad in mind, it shapes how we understand it. It shapes how we hear it. It shapes how we respond to what we hear. I've talked about this a lot at different times. Just after my first birthday, my dad left my mom and I, and throughout my kind of growing up years, I was really fortunate at different times. I didn't have language for it at the time, but God was very gracious to me along the way to bring several different people who would literally kind of play a fathering role in my life when that vacuum was created. The first one, and again, long before I would have understood the need or had a vocabulary, but the first one was actually my grandpa, who I called Pa. It was my mom's dad. And in those early years, kind of ages probably 2 through 10 or 12, just enormous shaping impact. And one thing that I never question, I don't ever remember having to question, does Paul love me? That was never on the radar. Over and over and over and over and over again, he lived in a way that conveyed he loved me. Over and over again. Right? He loved me when I asked incessant questions. He loved me when I broke things I shouldn't have broken. He loved me when I broke windows, throwing balls off of garages. And it shaped everything. It shaped and actually compelled my desire to be in his presence. There's some of my early years, there was nobody I wanted to be with more than him. I would go wherever he went and whatever that meant. If he was mowing his yard, I would sit on the step and wait. I wanted to be where he was. When he worked in his garage in the middle of the winter, when they were fixing this door, I still remember sitting, staring out a kitchen window, watching him work. Because I wanted to be where he was. His love motivated my desire to be in his presence. And he never made me feel annoying. He never made me feel in the way. Because out of his love, he enjoyed my presence. When I was old enough to do things with him, he let me. Like he actually kind of let me engage in some things way before I was actually making a difference. I really wasn't adding any forward momentum to the mower. When he pushed and I walked below his and my hands on the rail below, he was still the one making but he let me have this partnership chance. And listen, resting in this love that he had for me, it shaped every interaction. So when he did invite me to go someplace and I could, I always knew he actually wanted me to. When I got older and he challenged me and he started to ask different questions and he started to push me on some things to make sure I really meant what I said and what I was committing to, knowing his love for me shaped my responses, the thoughtfulness of my responses, and the caution of my responses. And the moments that he had to discipline me shaped my response. Because I can still remember at pretty young ages internally wrestling with this thing of all people, I don't want to disappoint him. I don't want to let him down. He loves me too much, and it compels this love back to him. It shaped every interaction. The very same thing can be true in our relationship and our engagement with Jesus. When we settle in on this fact that his initial motive, the compelling force of his creativity, was his overflowing love. Every move in the story of God is influenced by his heart and creation. And when we settle into that and we receive that and we drink deeply of that, it influences every response we have to him. It influences the comfort we have when it's a little challenging. It influences the hope we receive from him when things inside of us are in this process of his transforming work in us. It influences the courage when we follow him in significant sacrifice. Every response, every engagement is shaped by him creating us out of his overflowing love. So here's the question that we kind of got to wrestle with at the beginning so that the rest of the story can have some movement in our lives. Here's the question we got to begin with. Are we at home? Are we at home in Jesus' overflowing love for us? And if we're not, would we let ourselves move towards home in his overflowing love for us? There are a lot of reasons that it can be hard. I mean, again, a lot of us have been handed a picture or an image of a God that's more angry than he is loving and more removed than he is caring. and more impatient than he is gentle. And a lot of us have been handed that picture in very religious circles by people who were well-meaning. But it's added to our confusion and our frustration when we try and engage a story. So would we be at home in his love, or would we make a move towards becoming at home in his love by maybe first just saying, hey, okay, God, in your love, would you heal some of that in me? Would you heal some of what's contributed to me looking at you as anything but loving? Would you heal some of what's contributed to me looking at you as maybe you have a little dropper to share a little love with me on occasions when I'm really good? And would you literally let him just open up a waterfall of love on you so that you might be saturated in his overflowing love for you? You see, because everything else in the story starts here. Everything else in the story starts here.